Now for enterprise architecture, if you want a practical example, this is a real checklist that I use in fairly large scale enterprise architecture. The first item is about story and purpose. What's the story here? What are we trying to do here? If we haven't got clarity on these, then we shouldn't be moving on. The next one is, what is the scope and the stakeholders? What scope are we dealing with here? What are the boundaries? What are the edges? What are the connections? And who's involved in this? Who do we have to keep happy? Who do we have to keep involved, keep informed? Who's responsible for something? Next is about context, scale and scaling. We need to be clear about where actually it's happening and also how it scales. For example, things that work really well for a startup in the early stages of a startup, if you haven't dealt with the scaling problem before you start, then you're going to hit huge problems as you start to build, as the complexity starts to build. So we need to be clear about scale and scaling before we get going. We need to look for full cycle governance. Have we got the governance in place to handle not just the development of something, but how it's going to be maintained and how we're going to dismantle it at the end? If we can't dismantle it, if there's no way to turn it off, or if things will fail drastically if it comes to an end, then we perhaps shouldn't be building it. Another one is structural flaws. And the simplest example I can give of that is that we have an economics model that depends on infinite growth. And we are on a finite planet. You can't have infinite growth on a finite planet. There's a fundamental structural flaw there. Another thing I look for is what I call non-negotiable constraints. And even in the IT space, there are quite a lot of these. For example, the speed of light. You think, why bother with the speed of light? Why is this important? Well, it is when you're trying to do web connections or any kind of network connections, particularly across the internet, that can route things in any direction at all. Because if you're going up to a satellite and back, a single connection up to a satellite and back is going to be something like 1/10 of a second. It's a significant amount of time. And when you're running protocol upon protocol and dozens of different connections, the amount of time it takes to send the data through, it may not be long at all, but the time it takes to actually make the connection may be much longer than you think. The speed of light is a non-negotiable constraint. So something that works here across a room may not work across a globe. We have to think of these issues in any kind of architecture. And finally, we look at resistance to change. If people are unwilling to change, or if there are problems or deep vested interests against there being a change, then it's not going to be easy to get the change to happen. You're going to need to plan for that resistance before you start. So there's a simple example of a checklist that we would use before transformation, a transformation project, to make sure we don't run into trouble further down the line.